The room never raised its voice, never issued a statement, never explained itself, yet the message was unmistakable. In late January, as Rome prepared to say goodbye to fashion legend Valentino Garavani, the atmosphere around his funeral was defined by reverence and restraint, the kind that exists only in spaces where power is old, quiet, and deeply protective of its boundaries. This was not an event for spectacle, not a stage for reinvention, and certainly not a place for image repair. Yet somewhere between California and Europe, a different calculation was being made. According to insiders, outreach began almost immediately after the announcement of Valentino's death, not in the language of grief, but in the language of access. Calls were placed, names were floated, possibilities explored. At the center of it all stood Meghan Markle, a woman whose public life has long been shaped by the belief that proximity equals legitimacy. But this time, something went wrong. The outreach did not stay private. It leaked. And in elite circles, leaks are never accidents. They're signals, warnings, sometimes even punishments. When a funeral took place at the Basilica of Santa Maria dei Martiri, the guest list spoke for itself, an unbroken line of designers, editors, actresses, and political figures whose relationships with Valentino had been forged over decades, not moments. Thousands stood outside in silence, while inside, the rituals unfolded with dignity. Meghan was not there, not because she chose absence, but because absence was chosen for her. What followed was more damaging than a simple rejection. It was the realization that the door she believed could still be pushed open had already been closed, firmly and without explanation. The timing made the contrast impossible to ignore. While Meghan's efforts were unfolding behind the scenes, Prince Harry was in London, seated in a courtroom, visibly emotional as he fought a privacy lawsuit that forced him to revisit grievances from years before his marriage even began. Judges intervened. Tensions rose. At one point, his voice broke as he invoked his wife's suffering in a case that technically had nothing to do with her. The optics were stark. One half of the couple struggling publicly under institutional pressure, the other attempting to reinsert herself into an elite space defined by discretion and restraint. For observers in Hollywood and fashion, this was not just awkward, it was revealing. Funerals, especially at this level, are sacred territory. They are governed by unspoken rules that separate insiders from aspirants. You do not ask to attend. You're either invited or you are not. And when someone tries to cross that boundary, the response is rarely loud. It is silence. Silence that communicates exclusion more clearly than outrage ever could. This moment cut deeper because it challenged a strategy that had worked before. Direct outreach, strategic visibility, calculated appearances had once helped Meghan position herself alongside powerful institutions. But power evolves. What once tolerated disruption now values containment. The fashion world, like old money and old royalty, protects its rituals fiercely. To treat grief as a networking opportunity is not a minor misstep. It is a misunderstanding of how legitimacy is earned. The leak transformed a private failure into a public lesson. It told the industry that this was not about respect or mourning, but about being seen. And in a culture where true power avoids cameras rather than seeks them, that distinction matters. The fallout was immediate, not in headlines, but in tone. The story circulated quietly, passed between insiders, stylists, editors, publicists, each repetition stripping away a little more credibility. This was not outrage culture. It was indifference beginning to harden. In celebrity ecosystems, indifference is terminal. It marks the point where fascination gives way to fatigue, where the audience no longer reacts. For years, Meghan's narrative thrived on tension, on the push and pull between exclusion and aspiration. This time, there was no pushback, only a closed circle that refused to engage. And perhaps that is what made this moment feel so final. Not a scandal defined by noise, but one defined by absence. No invitation, no explanation, no second chance. Just a quiet reminder that some rooms do not open simply because you knock louder. In the aftermath, questions lingered not about fashion or funerals, but about power itself, about who is allowed to cross certain thresholds and who is forever kept outside. And for the first time in a long while, the answer seemed brutally clear. Long before the silence in Rome, long before doors began closing without explanation, Meghan Markle had already learned how to survive on the edges of visibility. Her early life was not one of inherited power or guaranteed access, but of observation and adaptation. Growing up in Los Angeles, she learned quickly that proximity mattered, that success was often less about talent alone and more about who noticed you, who remembered your name, who opened the next door. Acting offered structure, auditions offered hope, and rejection became routine. Years passed in relative anonymity, marked by small roles, brief appearances, and a constant pressure of being almost known but never fully arrived. That in-between space shaped her instincts. She learned to curate, to present, to anticipate what an audience wanted to see. When Suits finally gave her a foothold, it also reinforced a lesson she would carry forward. Visibility could be engineered. Attention could be managed. Image could be shaped if you worked hard enough at it. Then came the pivot that changed everything. Meeting and marrying Prince Harry did not simply elevate her status. It transported her into a system governed by rules she did not write and could not easily bend. The British royal family operates on tradition, restraint, and hierarchy, values that clash with the Hollywood logic of personal branding and constant exposure. At first, the contrast created fascination. She was framed as modern, outspoken, different. But inside the institution, difference is tolerated only when it does not disrupt continuity. Over time, tensions surfaced. Protocols felt restrictive. Silence felt suffocating. The very discretion that defines monarchy became a source of frustration. When Meghan and Harry stepped back from royal duties, they did so with a promise: freedom, independence, control of their own narrative. The move to California was positioned as a fresh start, a chance to translate royal notoriety into global influence. For a moment, it worked. Deals followed. Cameras followed. Platforms opened. Interviews, documentaries, podcasts all carried the same underlying message. This was a couple reclaiming their story. But telling a story repeatedly comes at a cost. Each retelling reduces mystery. Each clarification invites scrutiny. The more Meghan spoke about authenticity, the more audiences began to question what was real and what was performance. In Hollywood, credibility is currency, and credibility is fragile. It depends not just on ambition, but on restraint, on knowing when to disappear as much as when to appear. As projects rolled out, expectations were high. Budgets were large. Creative freedom was expansive. Yet the response was muted. Viewership numbers disappointed. Concepts felt polished but distant. Critics noted a lack of spontaneity, an overmanaged tone that left little room for vulnerability. Insiders began to whisper that meetings felt rehearsed, that pitches lacked substance, that ideas leaned heavily on image rather than depth. This is where the pattern began to form. Meghan's approach relied on access. Access to platforms, to events, to influential circles. But access without organic connection is unstable. Wearing couture does not make one part of the couture world. Attending elite spaces does not grant insider status if relationships are transactional. In fashion, as in royalty, trust is built slowly. It is reinforced by discretion. Those who belong are rarely the ones pushing to be seen. Over time, invitations became selective. Calls were returned more slowly. Enthusiasm cooled. And still, Meghan pressed forward, convinced that proximity could be regained through persistence. This belief shaped her public trajectory. Each appearance became intentional. Each absence was explained. Yet something fundamental was missing: the quiet endorsement of insiders, the unspoken validation that signals acceptance within closed systems. Without it, efforts to reassert relevance felt louder, more urgent. Meanwhile, Harry's journey diverged. His identity remained tied to legacy, duty, and grievance. Legal battles replaced ceremonial roles. Courtrooms replaced balconies. Emotional appeals replaced institutional authority. In this dynamic, Meghan became both anchor and catalyst, the focus around which his struggles revolved. Observers began to note the imbalance. One partner looking backward toward loss, the other looking forward toward visibility. Two different definitions of purpose moving in opposite directions. The background to the Rome incident cannot be understood without this context. It was not an isolated misstep. It was the result of years spent navigating systems that reward discretion while operating with instincts shaped by exposure. Meghan's challenge has never been ambition. It has been alignment. The inability to reconcile the performance-driven logic of Hollywood with the silence-driven logic of elite power. When she reached for the funeral invitation, she was reaching for something she believed she had earned through proximity and persistence. But in that world, belonging is not claimed. It is conferred, and once credibility erodes, no amount of outreach can restore it. By the time the calls leaked, the decision had already been made. The room had closed ranks. What followed was not punishment, but distance. And distance, in systems built on exclusivity, is the clearest signal of all. The stage was set, not for a comeback, but for a reckoning with a reality Meghan had spent years trying to outpace. The week everything collided did not begin with spectacle. It began with pressure building quietly on two separate continents, moving toward the same breaking point. In London, court doors opened and closed with procedural indifference as Prince Harry took his seat, facing a legal battle rooted in resentment that had been fermenting for years. In California, phones rang late into the night as plans were adjusted, contacts reviewed, strategies recalculated. Nothing about this moment was spontaneous. It was the consequence of momentum that had been building beneath the surface, unseen but unstoppable. As Harry stood before a judge, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew tense. His case concerned privacy violations allegedly committed by the British press long before his marriage. Yet his emotions dragged the present into every answer. The judge reminded him repeatedly to stay focused, to answer questions directly, to let lawyers do their work. Still, his composure slipped. His voice wavered. And then, without prompting, he brought up his wife. He spoke of her suffering, of the toll the media had taken on her life, of pain that predated their union but now defined it. Observers exchanged glances. The courtroom fell silent, not out of sympathy, but confusion. This was not what the case was about. Yet for Harry, nothing existed outside that gravitational pull. His personal narrative had fused entirely with hers. Across the Atlantic, the consequences of a different kind of miscalculation were unfolding. In Rome, preparations for Valentino Garavani's funeral moved forward with solemn precision. Invitations had been extended weeks in advance, guided by relationships measured in decades. As the guest list solidified, one name never appeared. And when last-minute outreach attempted to change that reality, the response was firm and final. There would be no exception, no accommodation, no quiet inclusion. When the funeral took place, the absence was conspicuous only because of what followed. Within hours, word spread that Meghan Markle had tried to gain access. That detail transformed a private exclusion into a public narrative. It reframed the event from a matter of grief to a question of intent. Fashion insiders whispered that the outreach had focused not on paying respects, but on visibility, on proximity to figures like Anna Wintour and Donatella Versace, on reclaiming a place among elite circles. The reaction was swift but understated. No statements were issued. No names were named. The industry simply closed ranks. What made this moment explosive was not the rejection itself, but the symbolism. Funerals are the final boundary in elite culture. They are where reputations are honored and where opportunism is least tolerated. By attempting to enter that space without organic belonging, Meghan crossed an invisible line. And once crossed, it could not be uncrossed. As images from Rome circulated showing rows of mourners and familiar faces paying tribute, the contrast with Harry's courtroom footage grew sharper. One half of the couple unraveling publicly under judicial scrutiny, the other exposed privately through leaked outreach. The narrative snapped into focus. This was no longer about individual incidents. It was about alignment, or the lack of it. Analysts began to connect patterns that had been dismissed as coincidence. The Paris Fashion Week appearance where access had been pushed rather than offered. The carefully staged Instagram moments that drew criticism for tone deafness. The media projects that promised intimacy but delivered polish. Each episode alone could be explained away. Together, they suggested a deeper issue. Credibility. In Hollywood and high society, credibility is not declared. It is bestowed quietly, reinforced through consistency and restraint. Once questioned, it is nearly impossible to recover. That week, credibility cracked in two places at once. In London, Harry's insistence on framing himself as a victim of media intrusion clashed with his own willingness to reveal private family details elsewhere. Commentators pointed out the contradiction between condemning press exposure and profiting from it. The judge's patience thinned as Harry continued to argue, his frustration spilling over procedural boundaries. The image of a prince struggling to separate emotion from argument circulated widely. In Rome, the leak achieved what a public snub could not. It redefined Meghan's image from aspirational outsider to perceived interloper. Fashion houses value loyalty and discretion above novelty. By attempting to leverage grief for relevance, she reinforced the belief that her approach prioritized optics over substance. Insiders noted that the reaction was not anger, but exhaustion. Brand fatigue had set in. This was the turning point. Not because it was the loudest scandal, but because it was the quietest rejection. Public outrage can be managed. Silence cannot. As days passed, secondary narratives emerged. Reports suggested that streaming executives were reassessing commitments. Invitations to industry events slowed. Publicists recalibrated strategies. The ecosystem that once amplified every move now responded with distance. Meanwhile, royal commentators drew attention to the widening gap between Harry and Meghan's priorities. Harry appeared increasingly nostalgic for structure and belonging, even as he rejected the institution that provided it. Meghan appeared increasingly focused on reclaiming elite validation through visibility. Two trajectories pulling apart under pressure. Observers cited the work of Tom Bower, who had long argued that ambition without authenticity would eventually collide with reality. That collision seemed to be happening in real time. Financial questions surfaced. Legal costs loomed. The promise of limitless opportunity in California looked less certain. What had once been framed as liberation now resembled displacement. The scandal was not that Meghan failed to attend a funeral. It was that the attempt revealed how far removed she had become from the codes governing the world she wanted to enter. The week ended without resolution, only accumulation. Accumulation of doubt, of skepticism, of distance. For the first time, the narrative surrounding the couple was not driven by outrage or sympathy, but by a growing sense of inevitability. Something had shifted. The story had moved from assent to reckoning. And as the noise faded, what remained was a silence that suggested the most dangerous phase had begun. The phase where interest wanes and doors close not with a slam, but with a final, irreversible click. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They settled slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a change in temperature that only becomes obvious when it is too late to turn back. After the Rome incident and the London courtroom fallout, there was no dramatic collapse, no public reckoning, no single headline declaring an end. Instead, there was distance. And distance, in worlds governed by access and perception, is the most telling response of all. For Meghan Markle, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. Invitations that once appeared routinely began to dry up. Conversations that once felt warm became cautious. In Hollywood, momentum depends on the illusion of inevitability, the sense that someone is ascending whether you personally believe in them or not. Once that illusion fractures, enthusiasm retreats quietly. Executives reassess risk. Publicists soften expectations. Doors remain technically unlocked, but no one rushes to open them. The fashion world's response to the funeral outreach was not condemnation, but withdrawal. Designers, editors, and power brokers are acutely aware of how proximity can be interpreted. Association carries reputational weight. Being seen alongside someone perceived as opportunistic invites scrutiny they do not need. As a result, the safest move is often silence. No statements, no denials, just absence. Over time, absence becomes pattern. Pattern becomes message. The message was clear. Meanwhile, Prince Harry faced a different kind of consequence, one rooted in visibility rather than exclusion. His courtroom appearance lingered in public memory longer than expected. Clips circulated showing moments of frustration, emotional strain, and procedural missteps. In the UK, where restraint is often equated with credibility, the display unsettled even sympathetic observers. Polling reflected a steady erosion of goodwill. The image of a prince at odds with the institutions that shaped him had once felt rebellious. Now it felt unresolved. In the United States, the impact was quieter but no less significant. The narrative of a couple reinventing themselves as global changemakers began to stall. Streaming platforms operate on metrics, not mythology. Viewership data does not respond to personal grievance. It responds to engagement. Projects that failed to capture sustained attention raise questions about creative direction and audience fatigue. Meetings that once focused on expansion shifted toward evaluation. The language changed from possibility to performance. This recalibration had tangible effects. Production timelines slowed. Concepts were quietly shelved. Development deals that depended on momentum lost urgency. In industries driven by trend cycles, hesitation is often fatal. When confidence wavers, investment follows. For Meghan, the cost was not just professional. It was reputational. In elite ecosystems, reputation functions as a form of social credit. It determines who is trusted, who is invited, who is protected. Once depleted, it cannot be replenished through effort alone. It requires time, humility, and a willingness to disappear long enough for memory to soften. Yet disappearance runs counter to the strategy that had defined her post-royal life. Visibility had been the tool. Control of narrative had been the goal. The consequences forced a confrontation with a different reality. Power that endures does not announce itself. It waits. The strain extended into personal dynamics as well. Observers noted an increasing divergence in public posture. Harry appeared drawn toward reconciliation, toward the idea of restoring some connection to the structures he had left behind. Meghan appeared focused on reasserting relevance within Hollywood's upper tiers. These impulses are not inherently incompatible, but under pressure, they pulled in opposite directions. One sought closure, the other sought validation. The resulting tension was visible not through arguments, but through misalignment. Their appearances felt less unified, their priorities less synchronized. Analysts and commentators began to speak less about partnership and more about parallel paths. The financial implications added another layer of pressure. Legal costs mounted. Lifestyle expenses remained high. Revenue streams, once assumed to be stable, proved conditional. In private, advisors urged caution. In public, restraint replaced ambition. The promise of boundless opportunity in California gave way to a more constrained horizon. For the first time, the future looked finite. Within this landscape, the observations of Tom Bower gained renewed attention. His long-standing argument that authenticity cannot be manufactured began to resonate beyond critics. Authenticity, in this sense, did not mean vulnerability on camera or personal confession. It meant coherence between action and intent, between values claimed and values demonstrated. The funeral episode crystallized this disconnect. It It suggested a willingness to prioritize optics over context, access over respect. In spaces defined by legacy, such misalignment is not forgiven easily. The broader cultural reaction was telling. Public outrage faded quickly. What replaced it was something more dangerous. Indifference. Social media engagement softened. Headlines lost urgency. Stories that once dominated cycles slipped into background noise. In celebrity culture, relevance depends on emotional response, whether positive or negative. When audiences stop reacting altogether, the decline accelerates. For Meghan and Harry, the consequence was a narrowing of narrative options. The rebel storyline had run its course. The victim narrative had lost potency. Reinvention requires a pause, a recalibration that acknowledges past missteps without relitigating them. Yet acknowledging missteps risks undermining the carefully constructed image that sustained them. This tension created paralysis. The world they sought to enter had moved on. The institutions they left behind had not called them back. They found themselves between systems, belonging fully to neither. The aftermath of the scandal revealed a truth more unsettling than rejection. Not that they were being actively pushed out, but that they were no longer being actively pulled in. In elite circles, that distinction defines fate. As weeks passed, the silence persisted. And within that silence, the consequences solidified, not as punishment, but as reality. A reality in which access is no longer guaranteed, sympathy is no longer abundant, and every move carries the weight of diminished margin for error. The story had shifted. What came next would not be determined by ambition or outrage, but by whether either of them could adapt to a world that no longer bent to their expectations. Away from headlines and courtrooms, there were smaller moments that rarely reached the public, moments that explained more than any scandal ever could. People who had worked quietly alongside Meghan Markle described patterns that only became visible over time. Meetings that ran long without resolution. Conversations that circled back to optics rather than substance. An intense focus on how something would look before how it would land. None of this was dramatic on its own. In fact, most of it felt ordinary. But repetition has a way of revealing character. What began as confidence slowly hardened into control. What was once ambition gradually edged into impatience. Insiders noticed that Meghan struggled most in environments where attention could not be directed or managed. Closed rooms, private gatherings, spaces where status was assumed rather than negotiated. In those settings, she seemed restless, searching for cues, scanning for leverage. Fashion executives recalled interactions that felt transactional rather than relational. Editors spoke privately about a sense of being evaluated rather than engaged. One longtime stylist summarized it quietly by saying that Meghan never entered a room without already imagining the headline. That instinct, sharpened by years in entertainment, became a liability among people who prized invisibility as proof of power. At the same time, Harry's inner circle noticed a different unraveling. Friends who had known him before California described a man increasingly unsure of where he fit. He oscillated between anger and nostalgia, between defiance and regret. Conversations drifted back to the past, to moments of belonging that now felt unreachable. His dependence on Meghan's direction became more pronounced, not because she demanded it overtly, but because he had relinquished alternative anchors. Without the structure of royal life, decisions felt heavier. Each choice carried symbolic weight. When he spoke publicly, he returned again and again to the same emotional wounds, as if repetition might finally produce closure. Instead, it deepened the sense that he was stuck. Observers close to the couple described a household under constant pressure, not from conflict but from competing visions. Meghan's energy was forward-facing, oriented toward reinvention and visibility. Harry's was backward-facing, rooted in loss and unresolved grievance. They rarely argued, according to those accounts. They simply moved past one another, each absorbed in a different internal narrative. In this environment, small incidents took on outsized meaning. A delayed call from a producer, a polite decline from a fashion house, a meeting postponed indefinitely. Each was processed not as an isolated decision, but as evidence of a broader shift. Meghan responded by pushing harder, increasing outreach, refining messaging, recalibrating her image. Harry responded by withdrawing, retreating into legal battles and emotional testimony. The distance between their coping mechanisms widened. People within their professional orbit began to notice fatigue. Not anger, not hostility, but weariness. One former collaborator described feeling drained after interactions, as if every conversation carried an unspoken demand for affirmation. Another noted that feedback was often received defensively, filtered through a belief that criticism was rooted in bias rather than substance. Over time, this made honest dialogue difficult. When truth becomes threatening, silence becomes safer. Silence, however, is rarely kind. The Rome incident exposed these undercurrents precisely because it involved a setting where silence is sacred. Funerals are moments when ego dissolves, when the individual steps back in recognition of something larger. To attempt entry into such a space without deep personal ties signaled a misunderstanding that went beyond strategy. It revealed a discomfort with being unseen. For those watching closely, that discomfort had been present all along. The difference was that it could no longer be managed through presentation. Even within Meghan's shrinking inner circle, doubts surfaced. Friends who had once championed her independence began to question whether the constant pursuit of validation was sustainable. Some quietly distanced themselves, not out of malice, but self-preservation. Association with controversy carries cost, even when the controversy is subtle. The absence of open conflict made the distancing easier to justify. It felt natural, gradual, almost invisible. Harry felt these losses differently. Each withdrawal reinforced his sense of abandonment. Yet he struggled to articulate it without framing himself as victim once again. Those close to him worried that his emotional vocabulary had narrowed, that he interpreted every challenge through the same lens of persecution. Therapy was discussed, reflection encouraged, but habits formed under trauma are difficult to dismantle without time and humility. Time, however, was the one resource the couple seemed unwilling to grant themselves. Public life demands momentum. Momentum demands output. And output, when disconnected from renewal, becomes hollow. This is where the quiet warnings of royal biographer Tom Bower echoed most clearly. He had argued for years that ambition without self-awareness leads not to triumph, but to exposure. That eventually, the gap between performance and authenticity becomes visible, not through scandal, but through repetition. Through the sense that nothing new is being said, only the same story told louder. In private moments, some insiders wondered whether Meghan understood this risk, whether she recognized that elite spaces reward patience over persistence. That being wanted is not the same as wanting to be there. The funeral episode suggested she did not, or could not, accept that distinction. And so the quieter stories accumulated. Not the ones splashed across screens, but the ones shared in whispers. The unanswered emails, the polite declines, the invitations that never came. Together, they formed a narrative far more consequential than any headline. A narrative of gradual isolation, shaped not by malice or conspiracy, but by misalignment between desire and reality. The tragedy, if there was one, lay not in rejection itself, but in the inability to recognize what the rejection was trying to teach. What this story ultimately exposes is not a single scandal, nor a single misstep, but a collision between two very different ideas of power. On one side is the kind of influence that grows quietly, protected by tradition, patience, and restraint. On the other is the kind that depends on momentum, visibility, and constant reinforcement. Meghan Markle's journey has been shaped by the latter, a belief that relevance must be sustained through presence, that absence risks erasure. For a long time, that belief served her well. It helped her move from obscurity into prominence, from supporting roles into global recognition. But the same instinct that fuels ascent can sabotage longevity when the terrain changes. Elite systems do not reward pursuit. They reward belonging. And belonging cannot be accelerated. The funeral incident in Rome was never about fashion. It was about legacy. Valentino Garavani represented an era where influence was earned through decades of trust, where discretion was not a strategy, but a value. His passing became a moment when those values were reaffirmed. Who was present mattered less than who was not. The exclusion communicated something fundamental. Access is not transferable. It is not inherited through marriage, nor acquired through outreach. It is cultivated through alignment with the unspoken rules of a given world. Meghan's inability to read those rules did not make her malicious or ill-intentioned. It made her mismatched. This is the deeper lesson running beneath the headlines. Ambition is not inherently destructive. What erodes credibility is ambition divorced from context. In Hollywood, constant reinvention is celebrated. In royalty and old power networks, continuity is revered. Meghan has spent years straddling these systems, attempting to translate success from one into acceptance in another. The friction was inevitable. Each system evaluates worth differently. One measures impact through engagement. The other measures it through trust. Confusing those metrics leads to miscalculation. For Prince Harry, the legacy question cuts differently. His struggle has been less about access and more about identity. Raised within an institution that defined purpose for him, he stepped away without fully replacing that framework. What followed was a search for meaning through grievance, through confrontation with the past rather than construction of the future. His legal battles, emotional testimony, and public frustration reflect a man caught between loyalty to his wife and longing for the stability he rejected. In this sense, Harry's tragedy is not loss of status, but loss of orientation. Without a clear role, every challenge feels personal. Every setback feels existential. Together, their story becomes a study in misaligned legacies. Meghan's drive is future-facing, oriented toward reinvention and influence. Harry's is backward-facing, anchored in unresolved pain and nostalgia. Neither approach is wrong in isolation. But combined, they generate tension rather than balance. One seeks validation from elite spaces. The other seeks absolution from old wounds. Both are searching for something that cannot be granted externally. This is where the reflections of Tom Bauer resonate most strongly. His central argument has never been about morality or intent. It has been about authenticity. Not authenticity as performance, but as coherence. When actions align with values, credibility follows naturally. When they do not, skepticism grows. The repeated attempts to control narrative, to reframe rejection as misunderstanding, to treat silence as hostility, have only deepened the perception that something essential is missing. Not talent, not intelligence, but stillness. Stillness is the currency of lasting power. It signals confidence that does not need affirmation. It allows others to project meaning rather than resist messaging. Meghan's greatest challenge may be learning to step back long enough for trust to rebuild. Harry's may be learning to step forward without dragging the past behind him. Both require a humility that fame rarely encourages. The legacy question extends beyond them as individuals. It speaks to a broader cultural moment where visibility is mistaken for significance and reaction for relevance. Social platforms reward immediacy, not endurance. Yet history remembers those who understood when to withdraw as much as when to appear. The most enduring figures are often the least noisy. They allow their work, their values, and their restraint to speak on their behalf. If there is a lesson embedded in this chapter, it is not that ambition fails, but that unchecked ambition without self-awareness becomes self-defeating. Power that must be announced is already weakening. Influence that depends on access rather than trust erodes quickly. Meghan and Harry's story illustrates what happens when modern celebrity logic collides with ancient hierarchies. One side bends, the other does not. What remains uncertain is whether they can adapt. Adaptation would require acknowledging limits, accepting exclusion without resentment, and redefining success away from elite validation. It would require silence where there has been noise, patience where there has been urgency. For Meghan, it may mean letting go of rooms she believes she belongs in. For Harry, it may mean letting go of battles that no longer serve him. Legacies are not decided in moments of crisis, but in the responses that follow. The coming years will reveal whether this story becomes one of recalibration or of continued friction, whether the lesson of Rome is absorbed or resisted, and whether either of them can find a version of influence that does not depend on knocking on doors that no longer open. In the end, the most revealing aspect of this story is not the rejection itself, but what followed after the noise faded. There was no dramatic confrontation, no explosive rebuttal, no triumphant comeback announcement. There was only quiet. And in that quiet, the reality of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's position became impossible to ignore. They were no longer at the center of the conversation. They were orbiting it. The world they once commanded through controversy and curiosity had shifted its attention elsewhere, and nothing exposes fragility faster than the absence of an audience. For Meghan, the path ahead looks narrower than it once did. The tools she relied on for years, visibility, strategic appearances, narrative control, have lost their potency. Hollywood does not close doors loudly. It simply stops calling. Fashion does not issue rejections publicly. It excludes through omission. Elite power rarely humiliates. It disengages. This is the phase that tests character more than ambition. When validation dries up, when access is no longer automatic, the question becomes whether reinvention is possible without spectacle. Reinvention that lasts is almost always quiet. It requires restraint, patience, and an acceptance that some chapters cannot be rewritten. Harry faces a different reckoning. His future is less about relevance and more about direction. The emotional weight he carries has become part of his public identity, repeated so often that it now defines him more than his causes or intentions. His longing for reconciliation with his family, for structure and belonging, stands in contrast to the public battles he continues to fight. The longer those battles drag on, the more they tether him to the very past he claims to want to escape. Healing cannot happen in a courtroom or on a streaming platform. It happens when grievance is no longer the organizing principle of life. Together, they stand at a crossroads that cannot be navigated through public relations alone. The brand they built was fueled by rebellion and exposure. But rebellion exhausts itself, and exposure without evolution leads to fatigue. Audiences are not hostile. They are tired of repetition, tired of contradiction, tired of stories that circle the same wounds without resolution. In modern culture, outrage fades quickly. Indifference lingers. This is why the funeral incident resonates beyond its surface details. It symbolized a deeper truth. There are spaces that cannot be entered through effort alone. There are hierarchies that do not respond to persistence. And there are moments when stepping back is the only way forward. Meghan's pursuit of elite validation collided with a system that values discretion above ambition. Harry's pursuit of justice collided with institutions that prioritize process over emotion. Neither collision ended in victory. Both ended in stalemate. The warnings articulated for years by observers like Tom Bauer now feel less like provocation and more like diagnosis. His core argument was never that Meghan lacked drive or intelligence. It was that drive without self-awareness eventually reveals its limits. Authenticity cannot be manufactured indefinitely. At some point, the performance cracks and audiences sense it. When that happens, no amount of refinement can restore trust overnight. What remains is choice. Meghan can continue chasing rooms that resist her, or she can redefine success away from elite approval. Harry can continue litigating the past, or he can begin constructing a future not anchored in grievance. Neither path is easy. Both require surrendering something deeply held. For Meghan, it may be the belief that visibility equals power. For Harry, it may be the belief that vindication will bring peace. The tragedy of their story is not downfall, but stagnation. A slow suspension between what was promised and what is possible. Fame without trust. Influence without belonging. Freedom without clarity. These are unstable foundations. They do not collapse spectacularly. They erode. And perhaps that is the final irony. For a couple once defined by noise, the most decisive verdict has come in silence. No invitations. No urgency. No outrage. Just a world that has moved on. In media and power alike, silence is not emptiness. It is judgment. Whether this becomes an ending or a turning point depends entirely on what they do next. Not what they say, not what they release, but how long they're willing to step back, listen, and allow the dust to settle. Because in the systems they aspire to influence, the loudest move is often restraint. And the hardest lesson to accept is that some doors only reopen when you stop knocking.